You are about to listen to the full interview with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Sections of it were originally included in our Sierra Sounds episode. Dr. Meldrum is a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, with a special interest in human bipedalism. His fascination with Sasquatch has crowned him being the eminent scientist pushing for serious discussions on the topic. His lab houses over 300 Sasquatch footprint casts, and he publishes a peer-reviewed paper called the Relic Hominoid. We hope you enjoy.
Well, my name is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, where I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs and do research in physical anthropology, particularly aspects of human evolution and functional morphology, especially the evolution of human bipedalism. And it's that interest that, very, very broad, approach from the perspective of functional morphology, looking at fossil skeletal remains, of comparative studies of living primates and human locomotor function and anatomy and so forth. But it's that focus on those specializations for walking on two legs that really was the impulse. That's why this question of the existence of Sasquatch is more than just a weekend avocational interest of mine. Mm-hmm. This is a part and parcel of my research program, because if there is another persistent population, a relic hominoid, that also exhibits that otherwise considered somewhat singular adaptation of walking on two legs, that would provide great insight into our understanding of its pattern and process of emerging.
Yeah. Just in case anyone doesn't know what Sasquatch is, could you just kind of give me some background on what Sasquatch is and where is it most commonly cited?
Right. Well, Sasquatch is a name, an anglicized form of a indigenous name derived particularly from the tribes of the British Columbia coast of the Pacific Northwest, which translates essentially as wild man of the woods. And throughout history, we have evidence of a fascination by human cultures with the possible existence of non-human, humanoid creatures that usually are denizens of the forests, the hinterlands, the mountains and forested regions of the world, and so Sasquatch is a North American manifestation of some of that notion, and so we're talking in this case about a relic hominoid, as I would refer to it, a persistent population of in this case very large, averaging anywhere from 6.5 to 9.5 feet tall, hair covered, but otherwise generally humanoid looking in appearance, only in the sense that it stands upright, vaguely the outline of a human, but there's so many aspects, and we could go on and on about the distinguishing characteristics. Very large in physique, very robust, very ape-like in many of its qualities, but resembling humans in that it stands and walks and runs on two legs.
Could you tell me about the time that you got introduced to the Sasquatch, and what is it about that moment that drew you into the search?
Certainly. The first exposure to the concept of Sasquatch or Bigfoot, as it was labeled at that point in my experience, was way back in the late 1960s when I was in fifth grade. And at a time when I was, ever since I was a little kid and could get out on my own, I was always collecting things and insect collections and bringing home animals and was fascinated with natural history and as well as do many young people of that period of their lives, went through a dinosaur period where I was fascinated with all things prehistoric and dinosaurs and Ice Age megafauna and cavemen and so forth. And so one day at school, the kids were abuzz talking about this movie that was advertised to be shown shortly in Spokane at the Coliseum about Bigfoot. And I'm now just as I say that, I'm not quite sure if at that time I had an inkling of what the abominable snowman was at that time, because that was back in the 50s. I was born in 58, so I kind of came on the tail end of that buzz. But this was my first notion of Bigfoot, but it seemed to embody all those things that I was fascinated with already. And so I had to see this and convinced my dad to take me, and of course my younger brother came along, and we saw this film and didn't meet personally, but were introduced to Roger Patterson and his claims. And I was just mesmerized and became a focal point. Now, I won't go so far as saying an obsession, but I was at being somewhat of a collector. When I started in on something, I went after it and began looking for newspaper clippings and things like that, magazine articles that would come out. I can remember, at that time, one of the only magazines that really carried stories were the men's adventure magazines. Not the girly magazines, but a little bit, the True and the Saga and the Argosy. And I can remember, discreetly slipping into the grocery store, department store, and sneaking a peek at the table of contents of Saga to see if it had anything about Bigfoot or the abominable snowman. And of course, it was before the age of copy machines, and so I would very diligently transcribe on my mom's old typewriter passages from the books I could find that had mention of the abominable snowman and other things relating to wild men, and tape recording movie soundtracks. We'd wait till they came to the drive-in theater so we could tape record the soundtrack and listen to those at night, falling asleep to the soundtrack of The Legend of Boggy Creek or something like that. So that interest waxed and waned, as I grew up. It kind of came and went, as did the public interest and the coverage. In an age prior to social media, with now its ever-present presence in front of your face. But when I ultimately pursued my career and settled on a career in anatomical sciences, in academia, and I bounced around. I was going to be a wildlife biologist or a forest ranger or a veterinarian. In fact, I entered the university on a pre-veterinary track and already had my 200 hours of work experience in a veterinary clinic and so forth. But I was seduced by science and blinded by science, as the song says, and that was actually, it wasn't until I was at college that I gained an inkling of how academia worked, how one could make a living as a academic scientist, and so that's where I ended up. And so my interests in how animals move and how humans have evolved and so forth still seem to guide that pursuit. And I ended up doing a doctoral thesis on terrestrial adaptations in African monkeys, with implications for the interpretation of hominin bipedalism. And so when some years later, events, some popularized events sort of reinvigorated my interest in the possibility of Bigfoot, which was always kind of rattling around back there because of my interest in bipedalism. I was in an exceptional position, of any academic who might turn their attention to this subject. I was rather very appropriately schooled. My predecessor, Grover Krantz, was also a physical anthropologist and an anatomist to a degree, but didn't have the particular specialization in pedal morphology and the interpretation of footprints as it related to the evolution of human bipedalism. And so when I was taken out and shown a long line of tracks, fresh tracks in the ground by Paul Freeman in just outside of Walla Walla in 1996, I mean, I was in a position to really appreciate and understand what I was looking at and evaluate it. I'm quite confident. I'm certain of that. And that set the ball rolling and set the hook. Whatever metaphor you want to use, that was the initial impetus.
Like you, I remember seeing the Roger Patterson film and just being so amazed and still amazed by it to this day. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around some of the evidence that exists for Sasquatch. I think particularly with Ray Wallace when he came out with the footprint cast. I still hear people mention that as the explanation for Bigfoot to this day. And I hear stories around how someone has come out and identified that they made the costume for the Roger Patterson film. But maybe you could kind of just talk on, because I think those are the 2 points that a lot of times people bring up when you discuss Sasquatch and say, oh, no, look, this is the key evidence has been disproved. Maybe could you talk a little bit on those 2 points
right.
And why those don't explain Sasquatch?
And I can give a very personal perspective too, because of course when the Wallace story sort of hit the wires and was repeated around the world, kind of like the party game Telegraph, it with every reiteration, it was embellished or expanded or exaggerated till everything was attributable to this one family. And I contacted Mike Wallace, who was the adopted son of Ray Wallace. He wasn't alive when all this went down, but he was sort of acting as the family spokesperson at the time. So I contacted him and I introduced myself and I explained, my involvement and my particular interest in the footprints. And I said, this is an interesting development. It should be very straightforward to document your stompers, your carved wooden feet, and very readily correlate those to the footprint record that I've accumulated. I have over 300 footprint casts in my lab now. And, if indeed your clan, as you've claimed, is responsible for the, manufacture, the fabrication of footprints all across the country, then it'll be very straightforward and we can lay it to rest, And, he says, there's just been so much publicity and brouhaha, and it's just got the family in a bit of an uproar. Mom's really stressed and, blah, blah, blah. And, and there's talk now about a book deal about Dad's life, and they might even make a film about him. And so, I had asked for permission to just simply come and photograph and measure, and he wouldn't have it. And so I said, well, let me ask you, because the press is also reporting that, that your dad pointed Roger in the direction of Bluff Creek, and that, in fact, it was, that the Wallaces were responsible for the costume, for the person in the costume that he filmed. Oh, no, he said, no. He said, I'm quite sure that it's hoaxed, but our family had nothing to do with it. 2 weeks later, as the story was kind of cooling a little and attention was not as intense, here they appear on TV again, the whole clan surrounding Mom, and Mom is 5'2", by the way. And they're saying, oh yes, and they show a clip of the Patterson-Gimlin film, and they all chime in, oh yes, that's Mom in the fursuit, and Mom has this wry little grin on her face, like, oh yes, that was me, And then she says, yes, I couldn't believe he made me get in that suit. It was hunting season, And so just a 180-degree reversal of what he had acknowledged to me previously. So there's absolutely nothing. The prints that they have shown are either so crude and so ridiculous that nobody would mistake them for legitimate footprints, or the ones that got the most mileage were clearly carved in imitation of an existing footprint cast. And we can demonstrate that. We can demonstrate, and we established that, yes, Bob Titmus had given Ray a copy of this one particular footprint, and lo and behold, that set of carved feet that got all the press coverage is almost identical to those, but not identical. They could not have been made by those carved wooden feet because there are discrepancies, but yet they were clearly patterned. And that's why they looked so different. That set of carved feet looks so different than the pattern that he repeated over and over and over again. A Ray Wallace fake carved foot has a distinctive appearance, a distinctive style. The toes look like Easter eggs lined up with a straight rule, and there's this exaggerated split in the ball and these very bulbous, rounded contours. I mean, like I said, nobody with any savvy of footprints would mistake them for the remarkably animated, certainly not the footprints I examined fresh in the ground that had every sign of a spontaneous animated footprint, a whole series of them with the kinds of variation you would expect in a living, articulate, animate foot. So
yeah, he would have been a busy man if he could make his way all across North America, Canada,
yeah,
Pacific Northwest, and manage to pull off so many fakes.
Right. Even if it was practical.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the things that always amazes me about some of the footprint evidence is dermal ridges that are left in some of these casts. Can you talk about what a dermal ridge is and what it means, the significance of it in a footprint?
Right. Well, if you look at your hand, we all know about fingerprints and their use in forensic cases, criminal investigations, and so forth. Or identification and biometrics. So you have these ridges, these dermal ridges or papillary ridges that are essentially friction skin. They're studded with little sweat glands that provide just enough moisture. It's like the batter getting up to the home plate and spitting into his hands and rubbing it together. That little bit of moisture increases the coefficient of friction when you're holding onto the bat or a lumberjack with his axe handle. And likewise, that little bit of moisture on our hands helps us to grip things and pick things up. And that friction skin extends over the entire palm of your hand, as well as the sole of your feet and undersides of your toes. So you have friction skin there as well. And if the conditions are appropriate, and that requires the substrate to be very fine in particle size, like talcum powder, which you would find, say, on a well-trodden logging road where the trucks have just pulverized the dirt to fine powdery dust, or in places like southeastern Washington, where attention was first scientifically drawn to these by Grover Krantz, there is an inordinate amount of what we call glacial loess, this fine talcum powdery consistency sediment that makes up much of the soils. And so when it's wet, it makes a very clayey surface. If it's dry, it's very powdery. It's like stepping into talcum powder or flour. And so those very fine details of the surface of the sole of the foot will transfer to the soil. And then if they're found soon enough, because every passing vehicle is going to rain down another cloud of dust, or literally jiggle them out of, just like tamping cement, the ridges and irregularities quickly smooth out. Or if it's very moist, gravity itself will simply pull and flatten out this topography to a flatter surface. So they have to be found fairly soon, and then someone that has enough experience to successfully cast a footprint with the plaster of the proper consistency, so that the weight of the plaster doesn't obliterate, or very thin plaster literally wash them out and eradicate those details. transferring them, otherwise successfully transferring them to the plaster cast. So they're very rare. There's only, in the 300 casts I have, there's probably only a dozen that have any indication of ridge detail at all because of those conditions that I've just described. There were a couple that were discovered even earlier, before Grover drew attention. I had corresponded with someone up in northern Idaho, and a footprint cast had been made there, and an academic who they actually had a little cryptozoology club for the students in some of his anthropology classes. And they had investigated a very interesting sighting case and had cast a footprint themselves and had commented on these observable ridge details that were evident. But of course, it was never published, never popularized, whereas Dr. Krantz successfully got a paper published that described them in considerable detail, had them examined by latent fingerprint examiners from several different agency offices and bureaus. So it's really quite interesting. The tracks that I witnessed, again, were in Walla Walla, where that clay soil is predominant, and many of the roads, especially the farm access roads, the tertiary roads, are just graded tracks. They're not improved with gravel beds or anything. And those tracks that I saw were so fresh. When I first knelt down, you could still see skin ridge detail in some of them. Unfortunately, the weather conditions, it had been raining that weekend, which made the soil so moist and clay, and the scattered showers we had during that afternoon, by the time we returned with materials to make plaster casts, much of that detail, if not all of it, was obliterated and nothing transferred to any of the casts that I made.
I have a million other general Sasquatch questions I want to ask you, but the episode is about Sierra Sounds specifically.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of give me an introduction to what you know of the Sierras, what they are, and where and how they were recorded?
Right. Well, of all of the recorded sounds or vocalizations attributed to Sasquatch, I think the Sierra Sounds, they're kind of the Patterson-Gimlin film to all, they are to sound recordings what the Patterson-Gimlin film is to photographics. They are just kind of head and shoulders up there. Now, there remains questions about it, and of course, if you aren't open to the possibility of the existence of Sasquatch, you'll focus on all of the other potential explanations and hoax conspiracy theories. But basically what happened is there were a couple of brothers that had a hunting camp up in the Sierra Nevada mountains on the border between eastern California and Nevada. And their camp was occasionally visited by something that vocalized and left sign in the region. There was then an association by, if I keep the history straight, Ron Moorhead and Al Berry became involved, and they started making treks up. And when Al was a journalist, and so he was the one that kind of spearheaded the taking audio recording equipment up there in order to try to document this. This occurred during the early 70s, and over the course of a number of years, there was quite a lot of interaction. I think there's something like a total of 90 minutes or something like that of recordings. These recordings they're not just, a distant howl. Whatever it was approaching camp. The men would retreat into this wickiup, this kind of a elaborate lean-to of deadfall and so forth, and boughs and branches that made kind of a teepee shelter structure between some large trees. And from within there, they would stick a microphone out or hang a microphone from the doorway and record what was going on outside. So you can hear their muffled conversations and vocalizations as they call to and interact with whatever it is that's approaching camp. And whatever it is producing very loud high volume vocalizations. There's growls and grunts and chatter. Some of the most interesting have been referred to as samurai chatter because they sound like that very guttural Japanese utterances that you hear on some of the World War II movies and samurai movies and so forth. But the one that caught my attention more than anything was the whistle. There's a point where the witnesses they whistle trying to call them in, and there's a response. You can clearly hear the human, the kind of muffled sort of whistle and whistling between their teeth, which I cannot do. But the response comes back loud and clear, but it's different. It sounds like it has a harmonic, like there's an overtone to it. Now that's been described. I know there is one paper that's been published. It's published in the proceedings of a conference that was held up at the University of British Columbia, and two authors, Curlin and Hurdle. They're not linguists or bioacousticians, but they have skills in sound analysis, and they do point out that it is possible to generate that kind of harmonic if the microphone is saturated. In other words, if the sound is so intense and so close to the microphone that it can create this apparent harmonic. Or the other explanation is that it represents a much shorter vocal tract than the other very loud vocalizations, suggesting that they're creating this sound by also employing their pharynx. So they're not whistling through their teeth or through their lips, but they're whistling back in the back of their throat, which is really quite interesting. I mean, it like a bird would sing with its syrinx, it's called, and there are some examples of humans capable of creating an undertone. The throat singers of Juva and the Eskimos have a way of singing where they create this. It's almost like the drone on a bagpipe. You've got the pipe out front, but the drone, the airbag or bladder is making this drone through these tall pipes over your shoulder. And that was fascinating to me because that actually suggests the potential for some some extralaryngeal air sacs, perhaps, in the Sasquatch, which wouldn't be unexpected at all because they're present in the other three groups of great apes, the orang, chimps, and gorillas, to the greatest extent in the orangutan, to the least in the chimp. And so in humans, they're very rare, but they do pop up every once in a while. If you ever saw the movie Altered States with Will Hurt, when he comes out of the isolation tank one time and he's externalized his vision and he has grown extralaryngeal air sacs, and the radiologist looks at the x-ray and says, "What is this guy, an effing gorilla?" It was very apropos, but in any case, so the vocalizations are fascinating. They've also led to interpretations that suggest or hypothesize that Sasquatch has an articulate, intelligent language, that they are communicative on that level. And I'm still, for me, the jury is still out. I mean, I have the greatest respect for Nelson. He's a professional Navy-trained cryptolinguist who is now retired, but I've prodded and urged him to submit a manuscript or at least a report that we could. I edit an online journal, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, together with an editorial board of other PhDs and professionals, and I said we need to engage in dialogue by getting this out for peer review, because one of the advantages, not only is there the advantage of having the checks and balances of peer review, but peer review also promotes dialogue. especially for this subject, it allows me to recruit individuals with expertise who otherwise might not choose to be involved or to consider the subject matter. But when asked to, for professional service as a reviewer or a commentator, my experience, we're now in our 10th year of publication, is that even on a cold call, I've often gotten very enthusiastically affirmative responses like, "Well, this is really interesting, and yeah, I'd be happy to do this." So, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, he has demurred from taking that step, and so we're kind of stuck. It's like one of the other hesitancies I have about the whole thing is the footprints. I mean, my litmus test is the footprints, and when I actually have it because I pulled it off the shelf in anticipation of these questions. I've got a 45. Your listeners probably won't even know what that is. Not a pistol, but a 45 record, vinyl record, which I ordered. The title is A Living Legend, Bigfoot Sounds Off. And it was the first format of publication of the Sierra Sounds. And on the back, it has a photograph of this one states it measures 20 inches long. I think most of them came in that were stated as being 18 inches. But the thing about it that causes concern is the sole of the foot looks extremely triangular with a heel that's fairly narrow and 5 toes displayed almost like those notorious Easter eggs squarely across the end of the foot, so squarely that I can't tell you if it's a right or a left foot. And Ron has graciously shared photos of other footprints. There was a photo in his book Voices in the Wilderness, which also was cause for concern because it doesn't look like a spontaneous footprint. It has a little ridge of pine needle duff all the way around it, like it was shaped, And I'm not pointing fingers at anyone or passing judgment. I'm just saying that it makes me uneasy that there's not a compelling corroboration by very credible-looking footprints associated with this event.
Have you ever seen casts of the footprints?
Well, only photographs.
Oh, only photographs, gotcha. Okay.
I haven't had the opportunity to examine any of the casts from that site personally.
Yeah. In the recordings, we hear the vocalizations. We also hear wood knocking and the whistling. Can you kind of talk about the significance of these noises and are they commonly reported in Sasquatch encounters?
Right. Whistling seems to be part of their vocal repertoire, and those roots of that go back to Native American traditions. The Tzonaqua, the female cannibal giantess, the woman of the woods, wild woman of the woods, is always depicted with her lips pursed, as if she's whistling, or sometimes it's interpreted as a wailing cry. But that those pursed lips are very characteristic. So yes, whistling is frequently, and I mentioned, that I was impressed by the whistlings amongst those Sierra Sound recordings. Wood knocking has always been, or not always, but I think it really took on, can actually point to one person, and that was Matt Moneymaker from Ohio, where, of all places, in eastern Ohio. I shouldn't say it like that. After having been there, I mean, most people would not think of Ohio as a place where Bigfoot would hang out. But eastern Ohio, my first trip there years ago, I was quite intrigued. I mean, it's a lot of private land, and there are a lot of fences, but there's a lot of otherwise uninterrupted habitat up against the backside of the the western slopes of the Appalachian in eastern Ohio. Lots and lots of contiguous forest, and there's a considerable, not considerable, there is a respectable bear population in that area, and suggesting it could support an omnivorous species. But wood knocking, the shortcoming of that assertion is that, to my knowledge, and I could easily be proven wrong, I've never heard of or talked with a witness who's actually seen a Bigfoot wrap a stick against a tree. And if you ever try to do it out in the woods, when Matt Moneymaker goes out on finding Bigfoot, one of his tools of the trade is a little Louisville Slugger that he carries around in his backpack, because if you ever spontaneously decide you're going to do a wood knock and look around the forest floor for a good, solid, unyielding piece of wood that you can wrap against a tree trunk hard enough to make a resounding wrap, good luck. There, you might be able to reach up and break something off, but if it's for it to be big enough that it's going to survive more than just one or two wraps, you're probably not going to be able to pull it off of the tree trunk very, very easily. So the question is, is this a real description? Are they maybe pounding their chest or clapping their enormous hands based on the handprints we found and the appearance of Patty on the Patterson-Gimlin film? They're pretty big mitts, and we do have anecdotes of great apes, gorillas, for example, clapping to get attention of another member of their group. There are instances of when chimpanzees forage, they often use what's called a fission-fusion strategy, where during the day they split up into smaller groups to fan out and look for ripe fruiting trees. And if one is found, oftentimes in their excitement, the chimps who've discovered this tree will drum on the tree trunk or the buttressed roots of the tree in order to draw attention of their cohorts to come and help eat the fruit while it's ripe.
Yeah, that was going to be my question: is does this behavior have any connection to any known primates, the whistling, wood knocking, or is this something that's unique to Sasquatch?
Well, it does. I mean, I think there are analogs, and some have said great apes are incapable of whistling; they just don't whistle. Well, there may not be good observations recorded or documented of whistling spontaneously, but they're capable. There's a great example. If you Google whistling orangutan, there's one orangutan who one of his keepers used to always whistle while he was working. And the orangutan learned how to whistle. And they couldn't figure out where this whistling was coming from for the longest time until they realized it was the orangutan. So just like things like swimming or eating fish, there was a paucity of any documentation. There was, for example, the fact that Sasquatch seems to eat fish and to take advantage of the salmon runs and reportedly steal fish from the Native Americans' drying racks and smokehouses and so forth, weirs. Eventually, it's now been recognized that, yes, in fact, they will and do eat fish and catch fish and throw fish out of the shallows, onto the bank and consume them. So likewise, swimming, they have to learn, but they're capable of it, and sometimes they do it spontaneously. Not always. I mean, there's the stories of the chimpanzee floundering in the moat at the zoo and an onlooker jumping in and rescuing him and pulling him up onto the bank. But on the other hand, you can also, again, Google swimming chimpanzees and swimming orangutans, and when they've been introduced to the water from a young age, they very quickly become quite proficient. They just like most humans, they don't like to get water up their nose, and it's kind of comical to see a chimp holding his hand over his nose to keep the water out. But one clip is very impressive because the chimp is actually capable of diving down into about 8 feet of water, clearing a regulator on a scuba tank there and taking a couple of breaths and then swimming on. That's pretty impressive.
That is impressive.
Yeah.
I mean, the tapes are pretty dramatic, the noises. It's pretty clear that it's probably not just some known animal in the Sierras, but is there any animal in the Sierras that you know of that could potentially replicate this sound?
No, there really isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, the only times, there are some vocalizations of Sasquatch, just to paint it a little more broadly, that are similar to, if not mistaken for, sounds like coyotes howling or barred owls. At least some of their calls. Barred owls actually have quite a large repertoire of calls that many people are unfamiliar with. Most are unfamiliar with. But anyway, there are things like that. Sometimes deer and elk can make sounds that surprise people, or even things like bobcats. It's quite illuminating to do some research and look into the variety of sounds made by animals out there. But when you have something, like this, one of the things that the Kurland's analysis showed was that the Sierra sounds, fell outside of the typical range of vocalizations of humans, at least. I don't know that they did a lot of comparison to other sounds, but the vocal repertoire, that's one of the things that is quite interesting about the Sierra sound. See, I tend to in very broad brushstrokes, point to two different groups of vocalizations. These animals are typically out and about in a solitary fashion. Most sightings, most footprints are of single solitary individuals. Now they may, as with chimps and their fission-fusion, they may regroup later, and sometimes there are certainly females with offspring, if not a transient male forming a consort pair with a female that's receptive at the time, and it may be misinterpreted as a nuclear family group. But in any case, the point being, animals that do tend to disperse, at least during part of their daily routine, often have a loud call, a repertoire of loud calls that they use to advertise their presence, or to remain in contact with their conspecifics, or to defend a territory, advertise their presence to warn off interlopers, other males, for example. And but then there's these proximate vocalizations where they're chitter-chattering amongst themselves, and whether that represents some form of articulate communication, or whether it's just an exuberance of, if you get I don't know what the proper term for a group of, if there is one, for chimpanzees, but when they're partying, they're like a mob, and they can be quite raucous. Gorillas, much less so, much more quiet and docile, and orangs are very solitary, so they're also remarkably quiet.
Well, I guess given everything around the story of the recording of the Sierra sounds and the sounds themselves, do you personally feel that it could be a Sasquatch on the recordings?
Oh, I definitely think it could be. Yes. I mean, I wouldn't use the word believe, but based on the evidence, I think the possibility is very real, and it's very probable that it represents. I mean, given the scrutiny that has been directed to it, by comparison to some other recordings out there of supposed Sasquatch talking or communicating, they are much more naturalistic sounding, much more what I would expect for a large primate than someone trying to concoct an artificial sham. But I'm not 100%, put it that way. I mean, I'm much more confident, say, because of my expertise in the Patterson-Gimlin film, even though I wasn't there. But likewise, in considering all of the associated evidence for the Sierra Sounds, and not having ever been there and experienced it myself, I have perhaps a bit more reservation, and that may stem in part because of my lack of expertise on the vocalization. But I have applicable understanding and skills of comparative anatomy and vocal tract anatomy, and of course footprint anatomy, and so that weighs into the formulation as well.
A quick divergence from the Sierra Sounds. I have to ask, do you feel totally confident that what Roger Patterson captured on film is a Sasquatch from your studies?
Well, as 99.9%, yeah.
Wow.
I mean, short of absolute, because you can't be.
Yeah.
Everything's tentative, not having been there and witnessed it. But if all I had were the footprints to go by, that were documented by Roger and Bob, and subsequently photographed by Lyle Laverty and cast by Bob Titmus, and others have shown up. Apparently other people visited and made footprint casts, and a few of those have popped up from people's garages or sheds at various times. If I had just those, based on the appearance, the interpretation, and so forth, the dynamics that are not only recorded in the footprints but can be seen in a correlative fashion in the kinematics evident in the film subject in front of you, I would be convinced. I mean, that just adds to it. Then looking at the rest of the anatomy and mode of locomotion and its gait and so forth, I'm absolutely convinced. Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced to the point that I can be. But there's always that qualification. I mean, in science, as soon as you become absolute, I mean, it's dangerous to use that word.
Of course.
I'm overwhelmingly convinced. Put it that way.
Yeah. Do you know much about the history of Sasquatch sightings in the Sierras? Are they commonly sighted there? Are there lots of footprint sightings? There
are. I mean, if you go to one of the online databases like the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, you get a sense. I mean, that's not the end all by any means, but it does convey a sense of the number and type or the relative frequency, put it that way, the relative frequency and type of encounters, be they footprint finds or bumps in the night or visual encounters. But up and down that, from Northern California all across the state, and then down the spine of the Sierra Nevada mountains south of Lake Tahoe, yes, lots of encounters. I have had a few instances where people have contacted me directly. There was a gentleman who often, he was a trail runner, and he haunted the areas just north of Yosemite, and he encountered footprints, and they were quite convincing. They were about 14 inches long, and very interesting set of footprints. So there have been other encounters that have come to my attention directly, but of course lots of them indirectly.
Could you talk about how Sasquatch fits into different Native American legends of the area?
Oh, sure. It's almost ubiquitous. Well, it virtually is, because when you consider, the location that many of the tribal groups were very mobile, by choice or otherwise, because there was lots of displacement and shifting of territories and waxing and waning of population size and so forth. And so my point being that even tribes that occupy areas now that seem very constrained and atypical of where one might encounter Bigfoot, their oral traditions and legends extend to times when their population may have occupied areas that were ecologically appropriate, and so almost every tribe has some form of tradition about giants, and one of the common themes, they're often described as being hair covered, or sometimes they're called stick men or rock men. because of their what's the word I'm after? A rock man doesn't mean that the person's made out of rock, like a member of the Fantastic Four, but rather that that arrows don't seem to stop it. Basically, might give lend to that perception. But it's interesting that because there are these themes throughout, in addition to their big size and the fact that although they haunt the the nether regions of the mountainous forested areas, they're feared oftentimes because they often are attributed with abducting adults, especially women, and also children, and eating them. They are cannibal giants. And so, it sounds like a just so story, so maybe a boogeyman story that's told to keep children in line and in before their curfew. But a friend of mine was working for the Peace Corps in Africa and stayed on and became a park ranger, and they were working with chimpanzees and whatnot. And he shared a story, the experience they had. There was an incident that was kind of kept hush-hush because they were trying to develop, one of the goals was to develop ecotourism, bringing tourists in to see the chimpanzees, much like the gorillas of the Virungas, the mountain gorillas. And a woman had parked her baby under the shade of a bush. She was a few feet away working in the fields with others, and along comes a big chimpanzee, and here was fast food as far as he was concerned, and off he went. Yeah, the field workers went in chase, but by the time they were able to extricate the baby, it had been dispatched and partially consumed. Well, then no sooner had he told me the story than within a few months there was a press coverage of, it got to the point because of the drought, I guess, was what they figure brought it to a head, and they couldn't keep it under wraps any longer. In a 7-month period, there had been 12 instances of toddlers or infants being snatched by chimpanzees.
Oh my God.
And so
that is horrifying.
Yeah, and so suddenly a just so story takes on a whole different character. This isn't out of the ordinary, or not. Well, it is out of the ordinary. It's not something that happens all the time. It was, the population was stressed, food was at a premium, and they became the children became a prey item. Just like chimps will snatch monkeys, or they'll snatch fawns of impala or whatever. And anyway. But now suddenly you've got a situation where this just so story is actually right in line with something that's quite plausible for natural behavior of a great ape, just like the fishing we were talking about, or the swimming. It's interesting how some of the qualities and behaviors of the Sasquatch stories have actually anticipated subsequent discoveries about the nature and behavior of great apes. And this is one of that. So it's a theme. We mentioned the Tsonaquah with her pursed lips. Mm-hmm. She's also depicted with these big, oversized hands, which allegedly she smears pine pitch on, so that when she snatches up the children, she can get a good grip and pitch them into a basket on her back, which she takes home. Well, there's repetition. There was a petroglyph that an archaeologist in Wyoming showed me, which depicts the wild woman, by a different name. Here in Idaho, one of the names for this creature is the eater of children. And I've had students tell me, oh yes, my granny would always tell us, in the summertime we slept with the windows open. We didn't have air conditioning, so we slept with the windows open. She'd tell us to hush and go to sleep if we were making noise, laughing and giggling, that they called it the lost brother, would come by and reach in and snatch you away, and we won't know what's happened to you. So they would lie there just terrified that some big hairy arm was going to come in the window, and they wouldn't make a fuss. But that was the boogeyman story. You go down. I found a catalog of petroglyphs of the Anasazi, So the ancient Puebloans, and sure enough, right there, boom, jumping out of the page at me, is that same depiction like in the petroglyph in Wyoming. Big, broad shoulders, little head, big feet sticking off to the sides, and arms raised up with the big hands displayed prominently in the same fashion as the Sonequa often poses for her picture. You know, they have a ceremony with a Sonequa dance and a full costume with the body suit covered in made of a fur, and it's quite impressive to watch. She crouches down and she makes that whoop whoop kind of wailing sound, sometimes whistles, and then she's always depicted with her eyes sort of as a slit because she's a little dull-witted and rather sleepy, and I guess she doesn't like coming out in the daytime or something. But in any case, so after she's snatched up a few children and she's trekking back to her cave to have them for dinner, she gets tired and she starts to slow down. Pretty soon her head nods forward on her chest and she's snoring away, and the kids then creep out of the basket really quickly and run home. So rarely is a child ever eaten in the storytelling. It's the boogeyman, Hansel and Gretel, not pushing the witch in the oven, but they do make their escape. But it may be based on some historical incident, much like what happened in Uganda during the hard times of the drought season.
You mentioned you actually know Ron Moorhead personally. Can you describe how you two met and just a little bit about him as a person?
Well, I was reflecting on that, and I think the first time we met was almost certainly at one of these conferences. That's kind of the opportunity where a lot of us keep tabs on one another. But and of course, I knew of him. I knew of his involvement because of my early contact with the Sierra Sounds recordings and reading about it in different venues. Ron is a very, very mild-mannered man. He comes off very credible, very believable. He has some different ideas about Sasquatch and its nature than I do. I think he's strayed a little into the weeds with his notion of the application of quantum physics to the macro world, and how that would relate to the Sasquatch phenomenon. But I've had no reason to doubt his credibility, and it's always been an uncomfortable tension. My hesitancy to accept on face the footprint evidence, and then the potential implications of what that would mean if they're not credible. And so I'm usually pretty good at maintaining good personal relationships with individuals, even in the face of differences of personal opinion. As long as they don't devolve into ad hominem attacks in either direction, I try to avoid that and apologize if I've offended people as by inadvertently doing that. But I mean, my criticisms are always directed at the evidence, at the data, and that's one of the potential pitfalls of working with people in a group of non-professionals. I mean, my academic colleagues are seasoned and trained to expect their work to be held up to scrutiny and to criticism and testing, and not take it as a personal attack. Although, even in academia, personalities vary, and egos and reputations can sometimes win out over the ideals of scientific investigation and peer review. But for a lot of people in on the avocational side of this, or I'll just say non-professional, maybe a better way to say it, non-academics, that piece of evidence becomes their symbol of participation and involvement. And so questioning their evidence is interpreted as they take it as a personal affront because it threatens their claim to a seat at the table, so to speak. And so it's always a bit problematic. People constantly send me stuff to evaluate. Most react very positively when I try to just, systematically and critically evaluate it and show them the pros and cons of what they may or may not have. Others, whoa, suddenly I'm I'm the bad guy, and I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
so
of course. What do you think it is about Sasquatch that makes it a taboo subject in academic circles?
Right. Well, there are different answers to that question. I don't think there's one simple answer, but they include, as I just alluded to, there are individuals with strong personalities and egos, and for those people, some of those people, it's like they see anybody or any suggestions that they take such a wacky in their minds theory or idea or proposition seriously, then threatens their credibility, threatens their stature. And so it's all about personal reputation and ego in some instances. In other instances, it is a matter of a misapprehension about what can or can't exist. And there was a time, for the longest time, I just could not understand why was there this visceral response. I mean, I knew the history. I knew that science, in response to the Patterson-Gimlin film, really pulled back. That was a point where I think their feet were held to the fire, and they all faltered because, and I wondered why. Why would that be, that there would be such a reaction to the very possibility that something exists? Yeah, because at that time it really hadn't. The tabloid stigma sort of came in to play when a void was created by science completely withdrawing from it. So as I looked, I've with age, you tend to appreciate this more, but it's very important to understand the historical backdrop and context of ideas. And so back in the 60s, right when Ivan Sanderson was presenting his thesis of all these abominable snowmen, or ABSMs he called them, around the world, different types, and when Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin in 1967 claimed to have captured this, and when the headlines were in 1958, when Jerry Crew came down into town with that first plaster cast. At that time, the backdrop in anthropology was dominated by an idea about the way in which human evolution had transpired. There was influence on anthropology from the developing discipline of ecology, which in turn had borrowed a central principle from microbiology from the 30s called the competitive exclusion principle. No two species can occupy the same niche, same habitat. The concept of niche really burgeoned in ecology and incorporated that competitive exclusion principle. Well, anthropology, trying to be more interdisciplinary and borrowing principles from other disciplines, internalized that niche concept, and it was seen that the hominin niche was very specific, very narrow, bipedalism, braininess, and culture, and so there could be only one species occupying it at any given time. And so you had this vision of evolution, one species giving rise to another, being succeeded by another, and so forth, with the previous ones going extinct because there could be only one in that niche. Well, we now know that isn't the case at all. It's a very bushy tree, getting bushier by the year, it seems, and that many of those species have, or not many, I always say many, but a number of species. Anything more than one seems like many when you're looking from this side of the fence, I guess. But a few species, a few lineages on that bushy tree have persisted, at least recognizably in the fossil record, till much more recently than would have been allowed for just 50 years ago, or 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And so we've got Homo floresiensis, we've got Homo heidelbergensis, between 10 and 20 years, 20,000 years, in age. We've got Neanderthal sites. We have potentially Denisovans. We've got Homo erectus in the islands of remote areas of Southeast Asia. We had a jaw dredged up off the coast of Taiwan that looks like a Homo erectus, and it was preliminary date was 12,000 years in age. I mean, this is just a snap of the fingers. Why would we assume that all these lineages completely went extinct and we are the, quote, last hominin standing, when the rule rather than the exception of the past was multiple species existing across the landscape, especially in the face of so much interesting evidence that points to the persistence of those very species that, so the the orang pendek might be a Homo floresiensis or a relic Australopithecine, or maybe it's a relic terrestrial mainland orangutan. The Yeti may be a persistent Dryopithecine or Shivapithecine, whichever. We're kind of in the in-between limbo. The Russian almas may be a relic Neanderthal. Sasquatch or the Chinese Yeren might be a Paranthropus gone gigantic during the Pleistocene, or a Gigantopithecus. You've got something that's the right size in the right place at the right time. Why would that be such an outlandish proposition? And it's always interesting because, for example, Chris Stringer, a very prominent paleoanthropologist in the British Museum of Natural History, publicly stated that he thought it was not at all far-fetched to suggest that something like Gigantopithecus might actually persist in the dense forests of Southeast Asia. Well, but when I asked him, I said I really appreciated that acknowledgement, that possibility, but what about Sasquatch in North America? Oh, no, not in North America, not in the United States. How could that possibly be? I felt like saying, well, come over here. I'll show you how that could possibly be, where we could take your entire nation and stick it in one of those wilderness areas.
Well, that's the thing that I think a lot of people bring up. And it's one of my last questions here is people always wonder why we haven't found more evidence for Sasquatch's existence. Can you talk on that? Like what might be the reason why it's so hard for us to find hard evidence?
Well, hard, yes. And so I was going to say, we are continually finding more evidence, but it's not the conclusive evidence. And even the hard, I would argue, we have hair samples that defy attribution to common forms of wildlife that we just have not been successful in extracting DNA from. And it's not at all that surprising given the characteristics of the hair and the close affinity potentially of this species to us. And so most of the DNA studies, on those rare times they have gotten DNA, say from a hair sample, it invariably comes back as, quote, human. Well, they've only looked probably at, if we're lucky, one mitochondrial gene, even if a whole gene. And if you're looking at two species that differ by, say, less than 1% or 1/10 of 1%, then have you looked at enough sequence to draw that conclusion? The conclusion is either that it's contaminated from handling by the discoverer, or two, it's a misidentified human hair. But what never gets discussed, unless I bring it up, is the third possibility, that it is distinctive, but you just haven't gathered enough data to make that determination one way or the other. So there's that. And then there's the, where are the bodies, where are the bones? Well, again, I think the common denominator for those questions is the numbers. It's a numbers game, not a game, but a statistical thing. We're talking about a large-bodied. If we can extrapolate, and I think we're justified in doing that based on clues offered by the frequency of visual encounters and the frequency of footprint finds. We're dealing with a large-bodied, long-lived ape that reproduces infrequently, has no natural predators. It probably lives, given its size and its position, in the hominoid clade, to be at probably a half a century, 50, 60 years in the wild. So there's not a lot of turnover. If we look at examples of other great apes, take orangutans, they reproduce only once every, 4 to 8 years, depending on which study you cite. And so by comparison, if we look at, say, a rough estimate of what I think might be a population in Idaho here, about 150 to 300 in Idaho, compared to 35,000 black bear in Idaho. Now, when you look at that difference and you say, well, where's the bear bones and bodies? People do successfully hunt bear, and on rare occasions, despite some claims by some skeptics to the contrary, on rare occasions people find bones in the field of bear. We could turn, to something much rarer. How often has someone on a hike found a wolverine skull? There you're getting closer to the population numbers, the same habitat, the same kinds of ranges that we might expect for a Sasquatch, and they're ghosts. But in any case, animals like that, predators that don't have die natural deaths typically of old age or injury or disease, rather than predation, they're going to secrete themselves off into some out-of-the-way nook or cranny. I mean, just like when your cat gets hurt, it'll disappear for a few days. And, our cat got in a fight with the neighbor cat and got the worst of it, and she disappeared. We didn't know why. We thought she'd run away. Well, about 4 days later, she emerges from under the bed in the master bedroom where she'd been hiding, nursing her wounds, and then finally came out to take care of business. But they'll do that. But if the animal then dies, its body is quickly rendered by decomposers and so forth. And what bones persist? Gnawers and chewers, all the rodents, rabbits, even deer chew up skeletal remains to get at the calcium. And what isn't, and what remains exposed to the elements in wet coniferous forests, the soils are notoriously acidic, especially if you're in the Pacific Northwest, where the volcanic contribution is also acidic. The only place you might expect to find, and one I'd like to encourage people who are cavers or spelunkers, if they ever come upon unusual bones in limestone caves, take a close look, because that's where the paltry fossil record of Gigantopithecus has been found, is in limestone caves. And we only have them because porcupines dragged those bones into the caves where they chewed up the soft bits and the hard parts persisted and became fossilized. But that's why for 1.5 million years of tenure for that species, Gigantopithecus blacki in East Asia, we've got 2 jaws and a couple thousand isolated teeth. That's it, period. And were it not for the porcupines, we wouldn't have that.
That's wild. If listeners are interested in learning more about Sasquatch or any of the work that you do, is there a good place for them to go?
I think the best place, if you haven't read my book, is to start there. Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, which is available through Amazon, or Paradise K, parak.com also carries it very affordably. And then the best place for some of the latest developments and interesting articles and reviews of books and so forth, essay-style reviews and translations of historical papers and so forth of other researchers internationally, is the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, the RHI. And if you Google that, it pops right up. It's on the ISU server. So it's www.isu.edu/RHI, or just Google Relic Hominoid Inquiry. And as I said earlier, that's been running for about 10 years now. And so we're accumulating quite an interesting collection of papers and contributions, and I think people find those very interesting.
Let us know if you think Sasquatch could be real on Twitter and Instagram at strange_phenom and on Facebook at Strange Phenomenon, all one word. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Visit www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk. Additional music provided by Sergei Cheremizanov.